Welcome, everybody, to MRPA Presents Executive Functioning. Why are everyday tasks harder for some kids than others? Our trainer tonight is Amy Orlando. She is with the Chesapeake Center. And Amy, I'm going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself.
Great. Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here. Again, the name of the presentation is Executive Functioning. Why are everyday tasks harder for some kids than others? And my name is Amy Orlando. I have a master's in occupational therapy, and I work at the Chesapeake Center as an executive functioning and parent coach. So some housekeeping. First of all, thank you to the Maryland Resource Parent Association and to the Chesapeake Center. The website is here, is hyperlinked, but also you'll be getting a downloadable page with some of the key things that we talk about today. It's also going to have the Chesapeake Center's address on there. So the purpose today is to talk about how brains develop executive functions, what is executive functioning, and how the home environment can help. So later on, we're going to talk a lot about what you can do at home to support executive functioning. And then just some privacy stuff, right? The webinar is being recorded. You can exchange personal information in chat. Specific individuals will not be discussed. So I have case studies and examples. Specific individuals won't be discussed. If I'm using a name, it's going to be another name that I made up. Okay, so I'm going to first start with me. My name again is Amy Orlando. I have over 15 years of diverse clinical experience. I've worked in rehab. I've worked in schools. Right now, I'm specializing in supporting individuals with executive functioning challenges. I'm working as an executive functioning coach, a parent coach, and a life coach at the Chesapeake Center, focusing on working with neurodiverse young adults and adults. And I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, a master's degree from Tufts University in occupational therapy, and I have certifications in ADHD and in autism. So first, I'd like some introductions of you guys. So I'd love to hear your name, your location, and then if you want ages of your children. I know you put some in there already, but just I'd love to know who is here. And then questions are welcome. Please put them in the chat. And then a reminder this session is being recorded. So I just love people to put in the chat kind of who they are, the location, and the ages. I'll give you guys a couple minutes for that. Great. Okay. Yeah, it helps to know the ages because then I can kind of tailor what we're talking about. Okay. Great. Okay. That's really helpful. And it sounds like there's a big age range as well. I'm definitely going to try to hit the executive functions throughout the age ranges. I'm also going to be stopping at different parts of the presentation for questions. So if you have any questions, again, please put them in the chat. Or at that time, you can kind of raise your hand. And I'll try to, again, hit all the ages if I can. Okay. So the learning objectives for today is to understand the role of executive functioning when problem solving in daily life. Learn how different brain areas affect how we manage our behavior in the moment, right? So we're going to talk about kind of the brain structure and how that affects our behavior, recognize how executive functioning skills develop as a child grows, describe 4 common terms related to executive functioning and what they mean for your child, and then list the 5, I call them R tools, that can help support your child when they struggle with executive functioning. So we're going to first start with the brain and body basics for executive functioning. So the brain is built from the bottom up. Okay, so we have a couple different sections. We have the brain stem, which controls the bodily systems, heart rate, heart rate and arousal level. And then we have the midbrain, which is the limbic system and the amygdala. And then you have the frontal part of your brain right here, which houses the executive functions. And then behind that, you have things like motor, communication, emotions, memory. Today, we're really going to be focusing on the frontal lobe and the midbrain. So if everybody puts up like their hand like this, right? And then they put their thumb right in the middle, and then you put down these 4 fingers down here. This right here, the thumb, is your amygdala. That's where we're going to be talking a lot about where your emotions are and how that impacts executive functions. And then the front part here is your executive functions, which is called the frontal lobe, and that's where they're housed. So just to give you a visual, those are the 2 things we're going to focus on today in terms of the brain. So the amygdala, the role of the amygdala is an importance detector. Okay, so the amygdala kind of tells you how important something is. So again, we have the amygdala here, which is the little almond shaped, it's purple on here, and it's at the tip of the limbic system, and it looks for important stimuli and flags them as important or not or dangerous. We also have the hippocampus, which is important for short-term memory. And then this is all housed under the limbic system. But again, we're going to really focus today on the amygdala, but I thought this was just a nice visual so you can see where the amygdala is. So there's a couple different things for the amygdala. One is, again, it's an importance detector, and it flags different things. So for example, if something is boring, it's not emotionally tagged, it's not stored, it's basically ignored and forgotten. So an example of this one is when I'm talking to my little one about weekend plans, like she's not super interested in that, right? It doesn't really go to her amygdala. She doesn't really tag it as important. So then when the weekend comes up and I'm like, oh, we're going to the store, she's like, what? Like, I didn't hear that, right? Because it didn't even tag in her amygdala as something important. 1 second, sorry. Oh no, okay. Sorry about that. Okay, I'll just keep it on here. So then the next one is important. So if something is tagged and flagged for the executive functioning system to review and respond, that's another role of the amygdala. So if something's maybe important, then the amygdala kind of responds and goes, maybe this is important. Okay. So for example, if my little one's doing math, right? Math homework, and that she knows it's important, then her amygdala flags it and she goes, okay, this is important. It also has a don't like it tag. So it searches and it flags things as urgent and maybe turns up the arousal if it's something that you don't like. It also has a tag of danger and react. This is the one we're really going to focus on. It hits the crisis button, triggers the release of adrenaline and cortisol. And the important part here is the blood flow increases to muscles away from the executive functioning system. So again, if you think about the brain or the hand example, right? If the amygdala is firing a lot, the brain, the prefrontal cortex is no longer online. So basically there's no executive functioning happening. So it's really important to keep that in mind because the amygdala needs to be calm in order for executive functions to happen. And then another thing to remember is that if there's a false alarm, it takes 20 minutes to metabolize cortisol and to reset the brain to baseline. So if something happens and then there's emotional trigger, again, danger and react, it takes 20 minutes for the brain to kind of get back online and to start working again. So that one, an example of that, again, for my little one, is something like a math test, right? So if she's studying for a math test and she knows a math test is going to happen, her amygdala is firing, and it takes her a while to kind of to calm down in order to be able to do the math homework so she can study for the test. But I know that, right? I know that she kind of needs that time because her amygdala is firing. So it's important to keep that amygdala calm. So going again about the arousal regulation system, you have the sympathetic nervous system. That increases arousal, eyes narrow, breathing faster, and the body is basically ready to react, right? So that's that sympathetic nervous system. And so you have increased reaction, right? Decreased reflection. So again, if the amygdala is firing, you have increased reaction, but decreased reflection. So you're not really thinking about why you're doing something. You're just basically doing it. I have an example of this one is I went mountain biking in Colorado and I fell. And I could not get back on the mountain bike without slamming on the brakes. I didn't want to slam on the brakes, but my sympathetic nervous system was going at such a rate that I couldn't reflect on kind of why I was doing something. I was just reacting, right? Then you have the parasympathetic nervous system, which decreases arousal. Your breathing slows, and then you're ready to relax and reflect. Right. So if you have the parasympathetic nervous system working, you're able to reflect and make better choices because, again, your prefrontal cortex, which houses your executive functions, is back online. Deep breaths calm the system, right? The vagus nerve is the big nerve that is associated with the parasympathetic nervous system, and deep breaths calm this system. And then the last system I want to talk about is the affiliate system. The caregiver support during a stress response releases oxytocin, which lowers arousal and decreases the toxicity of a negative experience. And this builds resilience. And then, so a little tagline is hugs help the hurt. Right? So having that support during a stressful time. And we're going to talk about that later on different ways you can provide support. But again, the goal is to get that amygdala and that parasympathetic nervous system working so that you're able to now use your executive functions because it's offline if your sympathetic nervous system is firing. So I just wanted to give, before I move on, I just wanted to give a basic overview of the brain and body systems because it's important to understand that and the role, again, especially of the amygdala in executive function. I'm going to pause really quick before I kind of get into the meat of everything and see if there's any questions.
There are no questions in the chat, but if anyone has a question, you want to raise your hand, we can do it so you don't have to type it. Just do the raise hand function and we'll call on you.
This was just kind of the basics of the brain and the body. So there might not be any questions, but I wanted to pause a second to see if there was. Okay, we're good?
Actually, somebody said, is that 20 minutes for all ages, adults too?
Yeah, so 20 minutes, but that's like a really stressful response, right? So like if that's kind of if if there's a really strong response, it's going to depend on the amount of the stress that occurs. But yeah, 20 minutes to metabolize that and to get that brain back online. And like we'll talk about, there'll be different things you can do to help get the brain back online. But the most important part of that is that the executive functions and the reflection is not there, right? So you can't expect your child or yourself to sort of be using different executive functions or to make better choices when their brain's offline.
So I actually have a question. So
Yeah.
obviously everyone has executive functioning, but if we suspect a child does not have that, those are kind of the signs we're looking for, like, or that's how they don't, I guess, process the things the same way, say I do, because I think I have normal executive functioning.
Yeah.
If
So that's
a child
yeah.
doesn't, that's what they're missing.
That's a really good question. So the executive functions, and we're going to talk about this, but I can kind of jump ahead a little bit. The executive function is where emotional regulation and your ability to manage your emotions are housed, right? So if you have so in general, right, when the amygdala here gets hijacked, it's called amygdala hijacking. Your brain's going to be offline anyway, like for everybody, right? But if you have weaker executive functions where your emotions are being, and then the executive function is where you're kind of trying to manage your emotions, because that's where managing emotions is housed, it's going to be harder to control that amygdala activation, right? So your amygdala is going to get hijacked quicker because the connection between because it's the where your executive function is housed is just a little weaker. So it's going to be harder to manage sort of those emotions to begin with. So when the amygdala gets hijacked, it's going to make it that much stronger of an emotional response. Does that make sense? Yeah. So yeah, it's just something to something to note, and that the amygdala might just get hijacked a little bit quicker and more intensely because of weaker executive functions in the brain. Great. Okay. Anything else before I move on? We're good? Okay. So what are executive functions, right? Plain and simple, executive functions are designed to solve problems. Okay. It manages the when and how for goal-oriented behavior. So it's when, so for example, with my little one and studying for a math test, right? It manages when she's going to study for the math test. Okay, I think I'm going to study after I get home and have a snack. But it also manages the how. Right. So how am I going to study? Oh, I'm going to sit down. I like to study on the floor because it's more comfortable. I need to close the door because then I'm more focused. I'm going to study the first chapter first. And how am I going to study? Oh, I think I'm going to write flashcards. Right. So it's not just the when, but it's also the how. Right. A lot of people in my experience know that they want to do something and maybe when, but they don't know how to do it. Right. So they have these big goals of this is something I want to accomplish, but they don't necessarily know how they're going to accomplish it, which leads to procrastination or anxiety because they don't know how they're going to do something. It develops over time. So the frontal lobes finish maturing in the late 20s. I have some slides on this later, but it's important to remember that executive functioning is still developing, and that's normal and expected. It also develops with experience. So watching others, making your own mistakes, right? Like with anything, right? If you haven't done something, you don't know how to do it, it's going to be harder. It's going to take, I have another slide on this, but it's going to take more executive functioning and you're going to make mistakes. And it develops by you making your own mistakes, right? So if you always jump in and you help a kid, let's say, make spaghetti or something like that, right? Then, and and they don't actually make the mistakes themselves on kind of, how you boil the water, when you turn off the water, then they're not learning. Right. So it's really also about letting a child make their own mistakes and learn from their mistakes. Like we talked about before, it's dependent on appropriate arousal level, right? So too much arousal, then you get sort of that amygdala hijacking and the prefrontal cortex is offline, right? It's here. Or too little. Like if the amygdala doesn't flag something as important, then it's not going to get done, or there's going to be procrastination. I see this a lot with my clients when they have a homework assignment due, but it's not due for maybe 2 weeks. It's really hard for them to get the drive to complete that homework assignment because the amygdala doesn't think it's important, right? It flagged it as not important. So it's hard, and then that leads to procrastination because the amygdala again doesn't think it's important. So it's dependent on the appropriate arousal level. And it's dependent on basic needs, right? Are you sleepy? Are you hungry? Do you have to go to the bathroom? Right? Executive functions are really hard when you're tired. And I think we all can attest to that, right? You're tired, it's just kind of hard to plan and to organize and to really think through your day. So those basic needs have to be met. Obviously, hunger is another really big one, right? And I'm sure you all can resonate with this one, right? You're asking your kid to do something when they're hungry is really hard. So remembering those basic needs have to be met in order for executive functions to be firing. And then deficits or delays are associated with a lot of different conditions. So acute illness, ADHD, autism, trauma, mental health problems, prenatal toxin, head injuries. There's a lot of things that can lead to executive functioning difficulties or delays. So the first step in understanding behavior is basically understanding, right? So your understanding drives your intervention. So we have the iceberg, right? Behaviors at the top of the iceberg is what you see. So for me, it's my little one studying for a math test and just kind of sitting there, and instead of really studying, she starts tearing up and crying, right? That's the behavior I see. But underneath that is thinking, biology, and emotion. So she's thinking, oh, I'm terrible at math. I can't do this. What's the point? That's kind of what she's thinking, right? The biology might be that she is a little bit more of an anxious kiddo, right? She's a perfectionist. She wants to get it right. If she can't get it right, then she's kind of like, what's the point? And she gets really down on herself when she doesn't get the answer correct, right? So that's her biology. And then her emotions are frustration, anxiety, and all that. So there's a lot that goes into it. And what I see is the behavior, right? But you need to sort of look underneath the water level and to see what's going on. So again, your understanding drives your intervention. So who has executive functioning problems, right? The answer is everybody, right? We all have executive functioning difficulties, and everybody can improve their executive functions at any age, right? So now I'm going to go into the different executive functions, and we have, I believe, 4 of them. I'm trying to remember. We have 4 of them that we're going to talk about. And the first one is self-regulation. So this is the ability to manage emotions and your body. And this is when the feelings are present and the person, again, is able to manage them. So my little one is studying for her math test. and she's feeling anxious and frustrated, and she's able to manage that in order to study. It's a fundamental skill for executive functioning, but again, very vulnerable based on the amygdala activation, right? If the amygdala gets hijacked, right, then it's hard to self-regulate. But it is fundamental, because if you don't have the self-regulation and then your prefrontal cortex is offline, then your executive functions are no longer firing. So what you might see for this one is small frustrations cause outsized reactions, right? So for example, the pictures here, right? The little girl, let's say in the green, where her dad said no to something, right? And it's a small frustration, but it caused an outsized reaction where there's yelling and screaming, maybe a tantrum. Again, this is my little one studying for a math test and just getting really frustrating and burst into tears. And the emotions seem to hijack the brain, impairing the ability to complete tasks as expected. So the emotions take over: frustration, anxiety, anger, whatever it is, and they hijack the brain, and you can't complete tasks, right? And then what else you might see is that kids act young for their age. They need more support to cope and manage with their emotions, right? So a little bit more of parent support, or just kind of explaining what's going on a little bit more, but they act a little bit younger for their age. What better might look like for here is, so when you think about executive functioning, you want to think about what's better, right? So a kid with executive functioning challenges has executive functioning challenges, but it doesn't mean things can't be better. So for example, if you think of a kid that doesn't like what they have for dinner, right? And they sit down, let's say they're having broccoli for dinner. An example of self-regulation would be, a difficulty with self-regulation is that they sit down at the dinner table, they see what they don't like, they get up and storm out, right? They start, stomping their feet, and they just storm out of the room, right? What would better look like? Better would look like, well, maybe the kid still gets up in frustration and stomps his feet, right? So that's what better looks like. So not looking at completely managing the self-regulation, but just looking at what could be better. So that's the first one, is self-regulation is the first executive function. The next one we're going to talk about is inhibitory control. So this is basically impulse control, right? It's the ability to stop, which is inhibiting, and think before acting. So this could be a kid in just doing their homework, an adult behind them is talking and just looking at the adult behind them, right? And they're not even thinking, they're just acting, right? They can't inhibit the desire to look what's going on. The inhibitory control will filter out unimportant stimuli for the goal. So again, if a kid is doing their homework, right? The inhibitory control would be like, oh yes, I hear there's noise behind me. Or, I see movement, but that's not important. So let me focus on getting my homework done, as opposed to kind of looking over my shoulder. It maintains a goal-oriented filter. So again, what's my goal, right? What's going to help me get to my goal versus what is taking away from my goal. Again, looking at my mom and dad talking in the corner, or just like, or noise outside, right? It's maintaining that goal-oriented filter. What's going to help me get to my goal? Same thing. It's a fundamental skill, but it's vulnerable, right? Really based on sleep and hunger, and emotion. So it's very vulnerable, but it is a fundamental skill. What you might see for this one is impulsive choices without considering the impact on self or others, right? So if I, if I hear a noise and I get up and go check it out, right? Then I don't get my work done, or my work's going to take me 2 hours instead of an hour to complete. But difficulties with inhibitory control, kids will have hard time considering that impact on themselves, right? Or maybe it's a kid that is in class and the teacher asks a question and they immediately blurt out the answer, right? They're not considering the impact that has on others, because they're just acting, right? They're not thinking. You also might see that these kids are distracted by more interesting tasks that shift away from the more important activity. So again, what's going on in the corner, or the noise outside, or my friend talking, right? They're distracted by that, versus doing what's important, and hyper focusing on activities of the moment, right? So inhibitory control is about, which I have a slide on this later, it's about regulating your attention. So it might be not focusing on what you need to focus on, or over focusing on something, right? So maybe a kid that's super into reading, right? They're hyper focusing on reading, and they don't hear them, you calling them for dinner, or they're reading and they didn't get their work done because they were distracted by the book. They're hyper focusing on activity of the moment. Or could be distractibility and not being able to focus. It's again about regulating your attention for that. And again, what better could look like for something like inhibitory control is if a kid gets, is getting distracted, being able to kind of be redirected with prompts to whatever they're doing, as opposed to sort of just being distracted and staying distracted, being able to, with a prompt, be able to shift back to what they're doing. So again, that's what better could look like for that one. So we just talked about this. Inhibitory control, this skill directly impacts attention. Right. So there's two different systems when talking about attention. There is selective attention and vigilance. Right. So vigilance is scanning the radar scene, right, or screen. It's a big picture. It's kind of like the house lights, right? Kind of looking all over. It's looking at everything, looking at the environment, what's going on in the environment. And then you have selective attention. Selective attention is focusing on the little blips. It's like a flashlight. And I have a comic for this in 1 second, but the goal is dividing attention adaptively, right? So you're balancing kind of the spotlight attention versus the vigilance, where you're looking at the whole picture. So it's balancing the two. So a really good comic is this one, is Calvin paying attention, right? I'm going to pause for a quick second, and I want you to put in the chat, is Calvin paying attention? What do you guys think? What do people think? Okay, I got a yes. Yes. Something, yes. Yeah. Yeah, exactly, right? So he is paying attention, right? But he has selective attention, right? He's focusing on the paper, but he doesn't have the vigilance. He's not looking at the entire context. He doesn't see the teacher. So again, this could be, a kid kind of blurting out, right? And kind of so focused on themselves, right? That they're selectively like ready to answer, but they're not, again, looking at the context. They're not seeing the other kids maybe kind of getting frustrated with them when they kind of blurt out. So it's about adaptively dividing your attention, right? This could also be, I have an example of a client who really likes to work on her planner for school, and because she's very creative and she likes to do that before she starts work. For her, she is doing her planner, she's making it really pretty. All of a sudden, 3 hours passed, 2 hours passed, and she didn't get her work done because she's not able to, she was having difficulty switching her attention from the planner to looking at the time to kind of be able to get everything done that she needs to get done. So the next one we have is working memory. Working memory is your mental workspace, basically your scratch pad, right? It's the ability to hold information in your memory while performing other tasks. And then the ability to reflect on the past to remember what has worked. So I like to think of this like a plate, right? You can only have so many things that you could put on your plate until things start to fall off the plate. Individuals with executive functioning challenges tend to have a smaller plate, right? They just can't put as much on their plate without things falling off. So, and this is the ability, for example, you ask your kid to go get 3 things upstairs, right? It's their ability to remember those 3 things and go get the things, hold it in their memory, go get the things, and then come back. It's also the ability to reflect on the past and remember what has worked. So I'll go back to the example of my little one, right? When she's studying or when she's doing her math homework. It really helps when she has the door closed and she can't hear anybody. She gets very distracted when there's any noises. So the working memory part is her ability to remember, hey, when I close the door, I'm much more effective at getting my work done than working with the door open. So kind of remembering the strategies that have worked as part of working memory. What you might see is you might see that the kid needs reminders at the point of performance to complete a given task. So we'll go back to the example of a kid going upstairs to grab 3 things. They might need a reminder to grab those 3 things at the point of performance, right? So you're upstairs with them saying, grab your socks, a new shirt, and a towel or something like that. They need reminders at the point of performance, and they might benefit from one direction at a time. So as opposed to go upstairs and grab socks, a new shirt, and a towel, maybe it's one direction, right? Susie, go upstairs and grab your towel, right? One direction, because again, more than one that might fall off their plate, right? This also, another example of working memory might be a kid, again, in class, right, where the teacher says 3 different things, grab your workbook, open up to page 22 and a pencil. And the kid maybe does one of those, right? So they need more reminders at the point of performance. And then we have flexibility. I don't know what happened to the, oh my goodness, 1 second. What happened here? There we go. We have flexibility as the next one. Flexibility is the ability to problem solve, and it's the ability to revise plans in the face of obstacles, setbacks, new information, or mistakes. So for example, on this one, it could be a kid trying to do their homework and getting stuck and not knowing what to do, right? So it's the ability to say, oh, maybe I can text my friend, or I can look it up on the internet, or I can ask mom or dad. But instead, what happens is if a kid has difficulty with flexibility, they're not really looking around. They're not really thinking about their options. They're kind of honing in, and it leads to shutdown, overreactions, or trying the same thing in hopes for a different outcome, right? Because they're not really looking at all the different solutions to the problem. They're just sort of really hyper focused. And again, I go back to the example of a kid doing their homework and not using their resources essentially, right? Not asking somebody for help, or not looking maybe on the internet or those different things they can do to solve their own problem. They just kind of get hyper focused on the problem in front of them and not looking really for solutions. Okay, before I move on, I know I went through the executive functions. I want to pause and ask for any questions about those different executive functions.
So there was one in the chat that says, how does depression impact the amygdala's activation of systems?
Yeah, so depression is going to impact the amygdala in that things don't get flagged as important, right? And if things don't get flagged as important, there's less activation there, and if there's less activation, then it's hard to get the motivation and the drive, right? Because it just doesn't seem as important. It's the same thing with ADHD and dopamine, right? If there's a decrease in dopamine, then things aren't flagged as important, then they don't get done. So it's kind of just a muted response in that way. Yeah, and as we talked about, right, the amygdala is really important because if it's aroused too much or too little, then that impacts the executive functions and the ability to kind of have that goal-directed behavior. Yeah.
That was the only question I saw in the chat. If anyone has a question now, you can raise your hand and come off of mute and ask if you'd like. I'm Nataki? Did I say your name wrong? I'm sorry.
Yes, correct. Thank you. So just wanted to go back. So you're categorizing executive functioning is, I'm just trying to go through the list. So you talked about flexibility, you talked about impulse control, and what were the other two?
Emotional self-regulation.
Self-regulation.
And working memory. So there are a lot. So if you look up on the internet, there's like 11 executive functions. There's a lot, and each source is going to tell you different ones. I picked 4 that I feel are the most important. And we're going to be talking about tools that you can use to help your children. And these are the ones that really tie nicely into the tools, but there's a lot out there. I just picked the ones that I felt like were the most impactful. But executive function in general is just your ability to get tasks done, right? And you're basically just being able to have goal-directed behavior. So there's a lot of different executive functions out there. But yeah.
There was another question. How do you expand the size of the plate for a child?
Yeah, so we'll talk about this later, but well, definitely, I mean, we have like reminders and things like that, but expanding the plate, you have to make it memorable, right? So we're going to talk about this later, but you can do it what we call multimodal. So you can use movement, you can use you know, acronyms, you can use different things to kind of help make something more memorable and really actively engage with the material. If you don't actively engage with the material, it's not going to it's not going to stick, right? In addition to using what we call compensatory strategies, which is basically strategies like writing things down, and other things like that. But going back to what we've talked about before, just making sure, right, the amygdala is not activated, or not, sorry, too activated, making sure, you're not hungry, you're not tired, all those things is going to affect executive function anyway. And if you have weaker executive functioning to start and then you're tired or whatever, it's going to make that working memory or whichever component you're working on that much harder.
That is all the questions I see in the chat.
Awesome. Okay. So now we're going to go to executive functioning development. So like we talked about before, the frontal lobe does not mature until the 20s, right? And it's slower for men than it is for women. So we're going to start just with going bit by bit about the different ages. So executive function in babies, these are the neural connections that you see right here. It says at birth. Executive functioning is emerging, right? And memory is emerging, right? Predictability helps. Right? So having a predictable environment, encourage making choices, but limit the options to avoid overwhelm. So here are 2 toys, 3 toys, right? Making choices, because that's going to help with that attention, that kind of, scanning and looking at different options, planning, figuring out, what toy do I want to play with? But if you have too many options, then it's overwhelming, right? At this age, I mean, any age, right? But with babies, right, stress happens. Encourage self-soothing and support seeking, right? You want to have that safe and secure environment. In children, again, neural connections for a 6-year-old. Executive functioning is developing unevenly. What I mean by that is that different things are kind of online, but it's an uneven kind of progression. Attention is captured, but not yet controlled until age 6. So if you have 5-year-olds or 4-year-olds in like a circle time, right, and somebody walks by, all the kids are looking right at what's happening behind them, right? Because it's not controlled, right? So the attention is captured, something else catches their eye, they look over there. Until about age 6, which then, again, something happens behind the kids at about, age 6, they're able to hear it and kind of process it, but attention is still on what they're looking at. Increased use of rules and plans, right? So morning routines, nighttime routines, these are the rules when, in a conversation or whatever it is, using that, because again, predictability helps, and you're able to, we'll talk about this later, but the predictability is important because then you're able to use your executive functions for other things, which we'll talk about. At this age, also continue to encourage learning about other people's minds, what other people are thinking. So going back to the kid blurting, right? Why is that a big deal? Right? Why does it matter if I blurt out, right? Like, how do my friends feel about that? How does the teacher feel about that? That's that perspective taking, which is also important. Encourage a lot of little mistakes, right? Because the best way to learn is through your mistakes. And then hand the problem back to the child when possible. So for instance, if a little one comes to you and says, Dad, where are my shoes? Right? You can say, where could you look for your shoes? Right? You're encouraging that problem solving, that flexibility of, oh, I could look in my closet, or maybe I could look downstairs where the other shoes are, but you're encouraging the problem solving, as opposed to sort of, solving the problem for the child. And then we also have executive functioning in older children. So again, the frontal lobe matures last in the late 20s, right? So you look at the brain, it's at the front of the brain, it matures last. In older children, executive functioning comes and goes, right? Depending on amygdala activation, depending on, again, tired, thirsty, depending on kind of motivation and interest level, it comes and goes. Time awareness is not yet reliable for tasks. So a kid or an older kid, let's say 14, this girl's 14, says, okay, I think something's going to take me an hour, ends up taking her 2 hours, right? To do. Time awareness is not yet reliable. Self-awareness of strengths can be leveraged though. So if you have a kid who is the really creative type, right? And kind of likes to draw. And that's one of her strengths, using that strength to study, right? So you're studying something that's boring. Why don't you draw a picture of it, right? So knowing your strengths, older children, when they're starting to be self-aware of their strengths, they can use that to their advantage to be able to get tasks done. So again, going back to the kid that is creative with the planner, my client, as long as she doesn't hyper focus on it, she knows that's one of her strengths and she really likes using her planner and it gets her into work mode, right? She uses that and then she goes into work mode. Model, stop, breathe, and think, right? So something frustrating happens, right? Model the idea of stopping for a second, taking a deep breath, and thinking about your decision versus the amygdala sort of hijacking the system and just reacting, right? We want a response, not a reaction. And then use talking through tasks and support as a consultant, right? So the idea of your child trying to do something, and you're there to kind of talk them through it and to help support them to be able to get different things done, right? So maybe it is organizing their room, right? And they want to organize their room. You're not telling them how to organize their room, but you're there as a consultant, right? Where do you think you want to put that? Why do you want to put that there, right? You're talking through the tasks because for multiple reasons. One is if you talk through the tasks and the young adult, or the young adult or older child comes up with the idea, they're way more likely to do it, right? Versus you saying, do it this way. That's one. But also now you're encouraging that reflection, that flexibility, thinking through tasks, which are so important with the how, right? So you're not doing it for them, you're there as a consultant. Okay. Executive functioning control will vary with tasks and will differ from the chronological age or grade. So typically, with ADHD, the prefrontal cortex is delayed about 2 years. Okay, so what you would expect from a 11-year-old, if you have an 11-year-old with executive functioning difficulties, they're about 9 years old. But overall, in general, so this is a chart that has simple to complex, right? The more simple a task is, the more effective somebody will be, right? So a simple math worksheet, right? The more effective they'll be. When you get something more complex, like writing an English essay, right? Effectiveness is going to go down for everybody. right? But if you have executive functioning difficulties, you're starting at a lower benchmark anyway, even with the simple tasks, and then it goes down, right? So just kind of knowing that simple tasks are always just going to be more, you're going to be more effective versus complex tasks because of the complexity of a given task. Okay, I'm going to pause again. Any questions about executive functioning development?
There are none in the chat, but I don't know if anybody wants to come off mute. Yes, we're good.
We're good. Awesome. Okay, so here's kind of the meat of the presentation, is how to be helpful, right? So we kind of talked about executive functions. We talked about executive functioning development. And here is how you're helpful. Here are some tips on how to be helpful to help your kid work through executive functioning difficulties. So I like to think of it as tools in your toolbox, right? There are 5 of them, okay? You have regulation, routine, reminders, remodel the task, and reinforcement. So these are the 5 tools that you can use as a caregiver in order to help your child with executive functioning difficulties. So the first one is regulation support, right? This is sort of when the amygdala has been hijacked, right? The prefrontal cortex is no longer online. What do you do? The first one is co-regulation. Co-regulation is modeling calm behavior and sort of being there for your child. The affiliate system, like we talked about, releases oxytocin. And it helps reduce a stress response. However, you have to be well regulated yourself, right? So the question is, am I well regulated enough myself? So if your child is having a tantrum and you're really frustrated, right? You're not going to be a good model as co-regulation in that moment, right? Because again, the goal is to sort of decrease the amygdala response so that the executive functions can come back online. So that's kind of the goal of the regulation support. You model, stop, breathe, and think, right? You stop, you breathe, and you think. You can even do this when the child is completely regulated. And let's say you're checking your work email and you get a really frustrating email, right? You can even say this like, oh, I need to stop for a second. Let me take a deep breath. Okay, what am I going to do? Like, this email is really frustrating. I am going to leave it till tomorrow, right? Or I'm going to write a response, but not send it yet. So you can actually walk through your process so your child can see that and they can start using that as well. Something I like to use is a tagline, lend them your calm, right? If you're calm, they're more likely to become calm. So that's something you can use. Also, limit your talking until the frontal lobe come back online, right? So again, prefrontal cortex is offline. They're not really, they're not thinking, they're just kind of reacting. So talking can just make it worse, right? Murmuring can help though. Like, so if your child is having a difficult moment, you can, right? You're still there as a supportive presence, but you're not adding any talking, because the talking again, like they're not ready to listen, right? At that moment. If needed, gently shepherd to a safer space. So if your child is at a department store, right, and is having a hard time going to a safer space, because you want to give them space. You want to give them space to regulate, because again, talking doesn't necessarily help. Depends on the amount of activation, right? But this is sort of when the amygdala again has hijacked the prefrontal cortex. You want to shepherd them to a safer space so that you can give them space to regulate. You can also redirect in choices or in conversation. In choices, it could be, I'm sorry that you weren't, able to play, with these Legos. They're not available right now. Do you want to play with these Legos or your dolls? Right. For instance, again, if the child is able to sort of listen to that, and they're in a space where they are, or conversation. I have a good story on this one. Is I used to work for a school that worked with kids with special needs, and there would be a kid that was having having a really difficult time, and we'd have behavior staff, and the behavior staff would start talking about like the baseball game or the basketball game on, not because they weren't paying attention to the kid, but because they knew the kid really liked baseball or basketball or something like that. And that was enough of a redirection sometimes for the kid to kind of, calm down enough in order to kind of engage in that conversation, because they're like, oh yeah, I really like, that the Red Sox or whatever it was. So redirecting with conversation to kind of help, again, that amygdala sort of calm down, and help the kid with regulation. Also, you want to offer comfort items. These aren't conditionals. So, these aren't conditional. So a favorite stuffed animal, or maybe headphones or music, or, a sweatshirt. These are things that help with regulation, and they're not conditional, right? It's not, kind of calm down, then you get these. Also debrief later. Again, amygdala, right, is hijacked, prefrontal cortex is offline, even if it's a little offline, right? So if you look at my hand, this is completely offline, but even if it's kind of a little offline, you're not talking then, you're debriefing later, and then ask them for advice, right? So, Annie, when you were upset about your Legos, I offer you some other choices. Was that helpful? Right? Or what can I do? What worked, and what can I do better next time? Allowing the kid to give you some input on how they regulate best, right? Can be helpful. So that's my first tool, is provide regulation support. Because again, if somebody's not regulated, they're not using their executive functions because they're offline. Continuing with regulation support is thinking about, so regulation support is offering comfort in the moment, but also how to help for the next time, right? So something happens, right? And you are having a difficulty in the moment. Regulation is about, okay, next time this happens, right? What's going to happen next time? So you review the new plan beforehand. So for instance, if a kid is going to, let's say, a birthday party, for instance, and they get really overstimulated by the sounds and the people, and they have a hard time reviewing, and next time they go to the birthday party, reviewing the plan, right? So, next time you go to the birthday party, what's the plan? What's going to happen when you walk in? Who's going to be there? Those type of things. Review the prompt. So practice a prompt. So I need my space, or give me a minute, or whatever it is, and practice that, right? So when you initially saw the people at the birthday party, you got, really overstimulated, and I could see that you needed your space. What could you say? Again, I need my space. Practice that, right? Talk about when you're going to use that. practice stop, breathe, and think, right? So I'm feeling anxious. Let me stop, take a breath, and what can I do? Right? I could stay where I am and kind of, choose to talk to one friend that I know. I can say I need a minute and walk away. The next one is provide as little support as needed, right? So you want to be there as a support, but you also want your child to recognize when they're feeling dysregulated and self-soothe, right? So providing as little support as needed, but still helping them through the situation. Ask permission to help. Meaning if a child, is having some difficulty, and you want to help them, asking permission to do so and not just kind of jumping in. You're still there as a support system, but you're not necessarily just jumping in. And then later, like we talked about, ask, how did it go that time? Right? Was that helpful? What can I do to support you? Again, getting that reflection, because that reflection is critical, because that's how you're going to learn, what triggered you, but also kind of what helped with regulation. So if a kid says, it really helped for me to focus on just my one friend, talk to my one friend, that's great, right? Continue to help them identify what helped them. Or kid might say, no, I walked in, I noticed I was getting really anxious. I could feel it in my shoulders. I needed to say, I need a minute and walk away. That's great. But if you don't have that reflection, then the next time that situation happens, it's going to be the same thing, right? So having that space for reflection is really important. I'm trying, let me take a break for a second. I think I'm going to take a break after each of my R tools and see if anyone has any questions.
There was a question a little bit ago. It says, how does trauma affect the child's executive functioning age?
So I don't have, with ADHD, I know it's like about 2 years. I don't know for trauma, although I do know that the amygdala gets triggered faster, right? And also, I didn't go into it, but you have the hippocampus, which holds the memories. And trauma definitely kind of triggers the hippocampus and the memories, which triggers the amygdala, which has the prefrontal cortex go offline quicker. I don't have an exact age on that one, but it definitely affects it in terms of kind of that amygdala hijacking. And that's why I wanted to start with sort of that brain, and you can understand the neurology behind it, and why the executive function go offline. So that's why it's really important to kind of know that piece of it, because the amygdala and the hippocampus will get triggered quicker with trauma. And then as a result, again, the executive functions go offline a little bit quicker. Yeah.
That was the only question that was in the chat. Does anybody else want to come off and have a specific question? Nope. Okay.
Yeah, so for this part, I think I'm going to pause after each of the tools, because again, this is kind of the meat of the presentation, in terms of what you can do to help at home. So I'm going to pause after each one. So if you have any questions, again, I'll pause after each one, raise your hand or put it in the chat for sure. So we talked about regulation support. Next, we're going to talk about routines. So routines make things easier the next time. So the first thing I want to do, I want everyone to kind of get their chat up, because this is kind of interactive, is there's a PET scan study where they did something called a verb generation task. Subjects were shown a picture of a common object and asked, what can you do with this? So for example, you can see a water glass, drink. right? So I'm going to pull up 2 more pictures and I want you to write in the chat what you would do with this object. That's the first one. And then the second one, right? Yeah, and then you can kind of enter if you want, or just kind of, yeah, get the chat. There we go. There we go. Yeah. Yep. Right, open. Yep. Right, open. Yep. I put right and enter, right? But yeah, okay. Great. Cool. So the reason I showed you that is, sure. Yeah. So subjects were shown 40 objects in 1 minute. Okay. So that was the kind of the study. The reason I showed you that is that if this is the first time you're doing something, right, you've never done a task before, look at the prefrontal cortex, the front of it. It has to work really, really hard. It's lit up, right? It worked even harder than your language area did, right? Because it had so much work to do. It had to think about the object. You had to think about kind of your relation to the object. There was a lot of things that go. You had to think about your memories, like what have you done with it in the past. So there's a lot of things. So the prefrontal cortex was pretty much lit up, right? Even more than the language area, which is the little area kind of towards the base of the skull, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And then, so if I were to give you the exact same a pencil and a door, right? Look at what the brain looks like when it's practiced, right? The brain didn't really have to do much work, right? The frontal lobes have plenty of energy to do other things if needed, right? So that's the beauty of routines, right? That is if you develop a routine, the prefrontal cortex now is freed up to do something else, right? We'll talk about this later, but the prefrontal cortex is freed up to make a different decision or to regulate when frustration happens or to listen to you when you ask your kiddo to get, the table set, right, for dinner or something like that, because things are routine, right? If something's not routine, right, and they're doing it for the first time, the prefrontal cortex is already lit up and it's already focused on other things, right? And then the question is, what if it was a different set of items? What happens, right? So if you look at this, if you have a novel set of items, then the prefrontal cortex is working a little bit, right? But not working as much as it would have if you had something completely new, right? So the same task, but different items. Again, the prefrontal cortex is still working, but not as much. So the takeaway is routines free up the frontal lobe to do executive functioning at the same time with less stress. And what I mean by something novel is, let's say you have your kid who comes home from school, who does like a math, who sits down at the dining room table and does math, right? The first time they kind of do that routine, it takes them a while to remember, like, oh, first I have to, get home, and then I need to, have my snack. Then I need to sit down at the table and do my math homework. Right? That's new. That's something that you haven't done before. Practice is when your kid does that over and over again, starts with their math worksheet at the dining room table. And then novel would be maybe they start with their social studies instead of math, right? So it takes a little bit of prefrontal cortex of like, oh, what am I supposed to do, right? Because this is novel. I haven't done it in this order before, but a lot less prefrontal activation than the first time they did a routine. So, we're going to practice. So we're going to start with Ava. This is an example of Ava. So Ava is a 5-year-old girl who has a bedtime routine. her routine is bath, brush her teeth, bed, and book. So this is kind of her routine. Her favorite book is If You Give a Moose a Muffin. She loves that book. And again, this is Ava, and this is the routine that she likes. So keep that in mind, because we're going to use her as an example as we go along. So routines. The question is, how do you make them practiced, right? How do you build good routines? I think of them as like nesting dolls, where you start small and then you get bigger, right? So instead of the nesting doll starting from the top, you start from the bottom and you kind of stack them. So if you think of Ava, right? The first part of her routine is bath, right? So you want to start with something I call a when then routine. So it's basically when the timer goes off, then I go into the bath, right? So you're starting really small. You're not doing bath, then brush your teeth, then books, then bed. That's too much, right? You start small and you say when then. So when the timer goes off, then you're going to go into the bath, right? Once Ava gets that, then you can stack on other things. So when the timer goes off, then you get into the bath, then you brush your teeth, then we read a book, and then we go to bed, right? But you're starting small. You know that it's time to move on when the kid is doing the when then at the kind of at the level that you expect them to be doing that, right? So they're pretty independent, maybe with some adult support, but they're pretty independent with that. Then you can kind of continue to habit stack. But we call that habit stacking. And overall, habit stacking is more effective than time. There are certain things like taking your medicine and things like that you might have to do at a certain time. But when you say, I'm going to, do my homework at 2 p.m., right? You don't know really what you're doing at 2 p.m. And a lot of times, you're not ready to transition at 2 p.m. to do homework or to do something else, right? Versus if you do habit stacking, that after lunch, I'm going to do my homework. Trying to think of another one. After dinner, I'm going to get ready for bed or whatever it is. Then it's a little easier because you're habit stacking off of a task, which reliably happens versus time. Okay, so before, actually, let me go back. Yeah. And then kind of going back to my last point with Ava, right, is once she has this habit of her, the bath, then brushing her teeth, and then reading a book and going to bed. Let's say Give a Moose a Muffin was not available. Let's say she couldn't find it. Her prefrontal cortex now is able to be flexible and be like, oh, okay, maybe I'll read, a different book, right? Maybe I'll read Berenstain Bears or something like that, because she's now able to be flexible because she's tried and used this routine so much. Versus if she doesn't have a routine and she doesn't have If You Give a Moose a Muffin, then it's going to cause difficulty and potentially a meltdown because of her decreased flexibility, right? So having those routines are really important for that reason. I'm going to pause before I go into my next one, reminders, and see if there's any questions on routines or regulation.
There's nothing in the chat. If you have any questions, you can come off of mute. Nope. All right.
Okay, so we talked about regulation support, and then we also talked about routines and the importance of routines to, again, free up the prefrontal cortex to be able to, either whether it's memory or flexibility or whatever it is, being able to sort of do different executive functions because of the routines. So next is reminders, right? So reminders remind somebody what to do next, right? So we had a question earlier about how to increase plate, somebody's like working memory plate. And this is part of it, right? Is those reminders. So there's a couple different types of reminders. One is tying it to an environment, making it visual, making it auditory, and making it memorable. So I'll use tying it to an environment. Let's use Ava, right? So Ava knows that after she takes her bath, she brushes her teeth, right? She's kind of like the she's tying bathroom with taking a bath and brushing her teeth. So she's tying it to that environment. Also, you can make it visual. So Ava, if she's playing, let's say, with her dolls, downstairs, you could put a towel, right? So she sees a towel, so it's kind of a reminder of what's to come, right? I know I use this one personally. I have a planner that I always put kind of my clients, what clients I'm seeing. I leave it out on kind of my breakfast bar so I can always see it. And I'm making it visual. You can also make it auditory. So again, with Ava and a timer, right? With the timer, make sure that I have it down here too, that the kid owns it, meaning that they set the timer and they turn it off. So I have a funny story with this one that always makes me, I always think about when I'm giving these presentations. Is my little one was reading books. And I said, okay, in 10 minutes, let's transition off of the books. And she goes, okay, right. She sets the Alexa, everything's good, right? And I'm like, okay, I got this, right? And then the Alexa goes off and I say, Alexa, stop, right? And she doesn't stop reading. And I say, the timer went off. And she said, no, it didn't. And that was me. So again, she had selective attention, not necessarily vigilance, right? Because she wasn't scanning the environment. And it was my fault because I turned it off, right? So that was on me as opposed to on her. So if it's auditory, again, the kid needs to take ownership. If you're using things like an Alexa or kitchen timer, make sure that it just doesn't go off automatically and the kid actually has to turn it off. In terms of making it visual, right? That also you can write down on the dry erase board. I love dry erase boards because you can easily write different things on it. You can put it in different orders. I really like the dry erase. The kid writes down what they need to do, what they need to remember, the plan for the day, whatever it is. And again, if they write it down or they say it, they're more likely to own it. Right. Especially if they're the one that makes the plan, what goes first, second, third, what do you want your evening routine to look like? They're going to more likely to own it. And then also make it memorable. So for Ava, you can call it the 4 B's, right? Which is bath, brush your teeth, books, bed, right? I had a client, he was, I think, 13. And he had working memory difficulties. And his mom made up an acronym CLAWS. So every time he went to camp, he had to remember CLAWS, which was change of clothes, lunchbox, a water bottle, and something else. But I forget the last one. But anyway, right, they had an acronym for CLAWS. My little one her acronym is PTJ. So it's PJs. Yeah, so it's PJs and then toilet, or potty, teeth, and jammies. That's what it is. So there's different acronyms to make it memorable. Other things you can do in terms of increasing your plate is to use fingers, right? So you have 3 things you have to remember when you go upstairs, right? What are they? And then the kid can say, I have to grab, a change of clothes, a towel, and my socks, for instance, or something like that. So they're putting up the fingers, you're making it tactile. So there's a lot of different ways to make that memorable for them. So again, if the amygdala doesn't find it important or memorable, it's not going to tag it, and it's going to be harder to remember those things. Okay, any questions on, oops, go back here. Any questions on reminders or any questions on any of the tools so far that I've covered?
No questions in the chat.
Okay, great, we're doing well. Okay, so the next one is remodeling, right? Remodeling is basically how to get from here to there. So how do I get to the other side, right? So you're on one side of the riverbank, how do you get to the other one? So an example for this one would be a kid who wants to organize their room. They go into their room and it is really messy and they're frustrated and they don't like it, but they don't know how to organize their room. So they're on one side of the riverbank and they want to get to the other one, but they don't know how to. So this is remodeling. Remodeling makes it easier to get it right. So there is 3 steps, right? The first step is I do, right? So going back to the kid with organization, I do is set up an organization system. Depends on the age of the kid. If the kid can kind of reflect with you and like figuring out how you want to organize, great, right? But either way, you're setting up an organization system for the kid. You're doing it for them, right? Then we get to we do. So we set up the system, right? Then we do it together, right? So after homework, we use the organization system, right? So you're habit stacking after homework. So when homework is done, then we use the organization system. You're doing it together. So let's clean up your room together. So we're doing it together. And then you have you do, right? So you do is the kid or the young adult uses the organization system because they know how to do it, right? They know how to get over from one bank to the other, and then they can do it themselves, right? So it's I do, we do, you do. Okay, it's not just sort of use this system, but you're scaffolding it. You're doing it bit by bit to help them get it right, and it makes it easier again for them to get it right that way. So also you can remodel the task, remodel the environment. So there's remodel the environment and also remodeling the task. So remodeling the environment looks like reducing distractions and making good habits easier to do. So for example, with a kid who loves potato chips, right? You're remodeling the environment. You're not even buying the potato chips, right? Because if you buy the potato chips, they are going to eat them, right? They have difficulty with impulse control, or whatever the case may be, they're going to eat the potato chips. So you might as well just not buy the potato chips. And you make good habits easier to do. So let's say your kiddo likes carrots, but the carrots are kind of in a bag in the fridge. You have to go dig through the fridge. You put the carrot sticks on the table in a bowl, right? You're making the good habit easier to do and the bad habit harder, right? Another example could be a kiddo doing their work, right? Reducing distractions might be, again, kind of closing that door, right? You're reducing the distractions and making the good habit easier to do. So if the kid is doing work and you know that they want to keep the door closed and they really like music, let's say, you have their headphones right there by their computer, right? They pop on their headphones. Maybe they have a work playlist. You have maybe an iPod or something, where all they have to do is press start and they can listen to their music while doing their homework. And you're reducing the distractions as well by closing the door. But just remodeling the environment, so that you're making the good habits easier to do, versus the other habits. And then you also remodel the task. You can also remodel the task. So you can remodel the environment, right? But you can also remodel the task. So remodeling the task looks like breaking a task down. And what I mean by that is, as opposed to organizing your room, what does organizing your room mean? Okay, it means putting the papers in the desk, the pencils away in the pencil organizer, and papers on the floor go in the trash, right? You're breaking it down. So you're helping the kid identify the stepping stones to get to the other side of the little riverbank, as opposed to organize your room or clean your room, or do your homework, or whatever it is. You're really breaking it down so they know what that means, and it's the how. Also, you can remodel the task by time of day, right? So let's say you're working with your kid on cleaning up after they do homework. This is a big one in our house, right? Like, my little one does her homework and stuff is everywhere, right? For some kids, it's right after homework, you clean up, you're good. For some kids, it might be, okay, after dinner, right? Then you clean up. I know for my little one, like, once she's done with homework, she needs a break. She needs some decompression. So it works better for her to clean up her space after dinner. So we're still having it in the routine, but it's after dinner because that works better for her. Also, discuss what done looks like, right? So again, going back to clean your room, what does done look like, right? Done looks like, you can have a picture of what done looks like. You can talk about what done looks like. Your kid can draw a picture of what done looks like. But you're talking about what done looks like so they can break down the steps of how to get there, but also so you guys are on the same page. Because if you think done looks like something different from what they think it looks like, then there's going to be a miscommunication there, right? So you need to discuss what done looks like. I was actually just working with a college kid on this, and she was having to do a an essay, and she tended to kind of overthink it, and was really kind of looking at all the aspects. And I asked her, what does done look like? And it really helped her kind of hone in, because without that, she was overthinking the whole process, and things took her way longer because she was just really perfectionistic about it. And she felt like done never came. So discussing what done looks like is going to be really important. And again, if your kid has the ability, talk with them so they can identify what done looks like for them, because they're more likely to follow through with that plan. Okay, before I move on, questions about any of the three that we talked about: regulation, routine, or remodeling?
There was a question in the chat. It says, what happens in a large family when it's hard to keep the same routines each day?
I would say you pick the ones that are most impactful, right? So if you find that this one routine, for instance, is most impactful, try to stick with that, right? It doesn't have to be all the routines, right? Maybe it is bedtime. Maybe you know that if your child gets to bed at a certain time, things go a little smoother. Stick to that, right? It's not all or nothing, right? But as we show, routines really do help to free up the prefrontal cortex. And I get it, right? With big families, with busy lives, it's really hard to make things routine and to stick to them. but it's about picking what's most impactful, and kind of zooming out and being like, if I think of it like dominoes, right? If you push down this one domino, things at least go a little bit better, right? What is that one routine that could be a little bit, a little bit better? And what's that one routine that can make things go a little bit smoother? But don't think about all of them. Going back to the habit stacking, pick one, right? Any other questions or a follow-up? If there's any follow-ups, is fine as well. I would also say, just off of that point, I would also say, again, get the kids involved, right? Ask them their input, ask them, how can we make, this go smoother for you, and try to figure out for them too how it can work the best. And being flexible with time of day or reducing demands or whatever it is. And the last thing I'll add to that is, as parents and caregivers, you're already doing a lot of these things. It's about being mindful of what's working and doing more of that, right? Versus being like, oh, this isn't working, this isn't working. Oh, wait a second, this did work. Whatever it was, how do we do more of that thing to get that same result? So it's just a different lens of what's working, and let's do more of what's working. Great. Okay. Next, last one is reinforcement. So notice when they get it right, right? Praise specifically. So wow, I noticed that blah, 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 or you worked really hard on that, or she was so happy, or the teacher was so happy when you did X, as opposed to good job, or thank you for picking up, wow, I noticed you put, the crayons back in the box, right? Because then a kid knows what they're being praised for, so they can do it again. Right? As opposed to kind of general praise. Especially kids with executive functioning difficulties, praise the effort, not just the outcome, right? So, wow, I noticed you're working really hard on that math assignment. That's great. Because with executive functioning difficulties, the outcome is really, really hard, right? And the outcome might not even come, depends, right? So praising the effort behind it. You're staying really focused, or I like how you thought of different options, right? Or I like that you thought you might forget that, so you wrote it down, right? Praising that, praising specifically. Also, don't add but, right? So I see you, great job focusing on your math homework, but you're still looked over there, right? It kind of negated the praise, right? So praising specifically, and especially things that, that you feel like was better, right? Might not be, much better, but it was better, right? So going back to the kid in the beginning, with dinner time where he got up and stomped around, right? I like how you stayed safe and you stayed with us, even though you were frustrated, right? Again, you prefer him to sit down and eat the dinner, right? But it was better. So praising that.
Amy, there's
Okay.
a question in the chat.
Yeah, of course.
How to differentiate when non-compliance is willful behavior versus an executive functioning problem, especially with teen or young adults?
Absolutely. So with that, we would go back to the scaffolding, I do, we do, you do, and make sure they know how to do the thing, right? Make sure they know the steps, they know how to get there. They know kind of, what's expected, and they have the tools to get there. Some of it, especially with teens, might be motivation or understanding the why, right? So if you talk to your teen about something and they come up with a solution, they're way more likely to use that solution than you just telling them a solution, right? Which is where I'll get to where coaching really comes into play for sure. Because it's very much kind of self-reflective and built on the client with solutions and like coming up with their own solutions. But there's a lot of different factors, right? If it's motivation, it's but so partnering with your teen to help them identify solutions, helping them see the why. Why is it important that you do homework? And your why might be different than their why, and that's okay, right? Their why might be like, so I get to go out with my friends. Your why might be, okay, well, to get good grades so you can go to college, right? But partnering with them on their why is really important. And then they have the skills and they know how to get there, meaning they know the stepping stones to get there.
There's also a question, what happens when a kid hears praise as an implicit criticism of their previous failures or current lack of perfect result if focusing on effort, even when the praise isn't said with any qualifiers?
Yeah. I mean, that's really tough, and that's sort of where you might just want to be saying something like, I noticed that X, right? And as non-judgmental, good or bad as you can. Like, I noticed you put the crayons back, right? So it's not maybe even praise, right? It's just noticing something. You're noticing something that they did well, but you're absolutely right, right? Like, yes, kids can take that and they don't want to fail the next time. So that could definitely backfire. So just sort of just saying, I noticed that, right? Or what you see, right? You worked hard on that, right? There's no thank you. There's no, again, there's no qualifiers. It's just kind of what you saw and your direct observation. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Great. Okay. So we're gonna do, we have about 15 minutes left. I might have to kind of go through a couple of these fast, but it's okay. So we're gonna talk about executive functioning in action. So this is an example of my real life. I have two puppies. And the older puppy named Franklin takes medicine. And I would always forget to give him his medicine. So I used routine and reminder, right? The routine was when I opened up the dog food bin, then I gave him his medicine, right? So it was then. It wasn't after I gave him his food. It was when I opened the bin. The reminder was the pills are right there, right? It looks kind of silly. They're in the dog food, but if they're not in the dog food, I don't remember it, right? So that's a real life example from my life on how I use routines and reminders. A real life example from a client is an afternoon routine. So this little kiddo, 10 years old, he had difficulty with taking a shower, right? He didn't want to take a shower. And so we had a couple different things we had to do. One was regulation. So he got home, he was starving, right? So he had to have a snack first. That was his first thing for regulation. Then routine. So when you get home from school, then you're taking a shower, right? Then, because before he was taking a shower at night and there was always tears. And it just, again, speaking of little small things to make things go smoother, shower at night was not working. So the new routine was when he got home from school, then he took his shower. Reminder was mom put the towel right on his chair where he was having snack. And then remodeling was we remodeled the task. He's now taking a shower after he gets home from school versus at night, right? And that worked better for him after he had his snack, right? That worked better for him versus at night when he didn't want to go to bed anyway, and then he has to take a shower. It was just didn't work. So I have an example. It's called The Elephant and the Rider. Some of you guys might have heard of this. It's a story about executive functioning. The elephant represents the emotional, intellectual side. of a person, and the rider represents the executive function. So this is a little story, and I'm going to tie it back to sort of the terms we talked about and the tools we talked about. So one day, the rider and the elephant found a mountain blocking their way, right? And they had to figure out how to get through. The rider analyzed the problem and decided to look for another route. There was no easy way, right or left to get around. So he decided to build a staircase. So the skill was flexibility, right? He saw a problem and the rider was like, huh, you know, I could go this way or I could go this way. So that's demonstrating flexibility. The elephant didn't feel strong. Oh, he was big or strong enough and wanted to walk away. The rider tried to explain why his idea was a good one, but explaining didn't work. The elephant was upset, right? So self-regulation. The elephant was like, oh, I can't do this. Kind of like the question before, right? Like, I can't do the task, like it's too big for me. It's a self-regulation. The rider tried to explain it away. It didn't work, right? So the rider realized that the elephant didn't want explanation. He basically wanted to be comforted, and just to kind of partner with how they're feeling, right? So the tool is regulation, like we talked about, and just being there, right? Being there, safe and secure. You're not explaining why you should be feeling a certain way. You're just validating and you're there, right? So the rider came up with a smaller plan, which was to move small rocks in order to make the staircase. And the elephant felt like he could do that, right? So he remodeled the task, right? Made the task smaller, broke it down into a way that the elephant felt like he could do it, right? And then they built the staircase, and the rider was proud of their plan, and the elephant was happy they did it. And even better, the next time it happened, the elephant remembered that he could use small stones to make a staircase, and the rider was able to relax because the routine was built. So the skill was working memory, right? The brain remembered, the elephant in this case, oh yeah, if I use smaller stones, that I can do this, right? That's the working memory. What I did in the past works, and this is what worked in the past. And then the tool is routine. So you do it again and again. And then that's the routine. Okay. And then they got up to the mountain and they liked the view. So that was my little story. I have 2 case studies. I won't be able to get through both of them, but we'll do one of them, and then I can kind of wrap up. So my case study is Simon. Simon is a 14-year-old boy who is doing his homework. And when he gets stuck on his homework, he just kind of sits there and stares at the page. And you walk down as a parent and he's just staring at his homework. Kind of, you could tell he's really tense and and frustrated. So the first thing is, I want you to identify the executive function challenge or challenges in the chat, please. What are some executive functioning challenges that Simon is having? Okay. Yep. Memory, great. Working memory, great. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. So I have self-regulation and flexibility, right? But absolutely working memory, right? He doesn't remember how to tackle these problems, right? Especially, you're right, it seems like all of them. And that's the thing with executive functioning, is they're all intertwined. They really are, right? Maybe it's inhibitory control. Maybe he's thinking about what he's going to have for dinner, right? and he's distracted by his inner thoughts, right? It's all of it. But for this example, I picked self-regulation and flexibility because he couldn't think of another option, and he got in his head and was kind of staring at the page, which was his ability to self-regulate, which impacted his flexibility. But it's absolutely working memory, especially if he's done something like this before. It's remembering, oh, this is how I tackle this problem. Absolutely, it's working memory. So there's a couple steps. So you notice a challenge. The first thing you want to do is conference with your child, right? So you want to frame it. So it seems that when you're doing some of your homework, right, it looks like it feels overwhelming, which is self-regulation, right? And you don't know what to do next. Did I get that right? So you ask your child, hey, this is what I'm seeing. Is that right? Then you listen. So tell me what you think, right? And then the kid can say yes or no. It's actually really great when the kid says no, because then they're thinking about it. They're not just saying, yeah. Maybe Simon goes, no, it's not overwhelming. I'm just bored, right? Or whatever it is. Or I know what to do. I just, again, I'm bored or whatever, right? But if he says no, it's kind of great because then he really gets the thinking, you get the gears turning. Then you ask permission. Would you like some suggestions? I have 2 ideas that might help, right? So then you offer suggestions. So self-regulation suggestions could be taking the dog for a walk or grabbing a snack. Flexibility could be you have 3 things, and if you get stuck on this first thing, you can do the other, you can do one of the other ones, right? Or if you if you get stuck, maybe you have a list of things he can do. He can ask for help. He can text a friend, whatever it is. But you're remodeling the task to give him options, and maybe you make it visual so he remembers, right? So you offer suggestions. Okay, I'll go through this one, I guess, really quick, and then I'll finish up. So then the next case study I have is Kiara. Kiara is a little 6-year-old girl who loves gymnastics. And, she goes upstairs every time before gymnastics. She needs a towel, and she needs a towel, water bottle, and her socks. She goes upstairs and she starts playing with her dolls, and forgets about all this stuff that she needs. And then she comes down, doesn't have anything, and she's late to gymnastics, right? So she's having trouble with inhibitory control, meaning that sees her dolls and it's like, oh, I want to play with those instead, right? And working memory, meaning that she forgot what she needs, right? Completely out the window, right? So she's having trouble with these 2 things. First thing you do is conference with your child. So when getting ready for gymnastics, there seems to be a problem. You're getting distracted, right? And you start doing other things and you forget what you need. Tell me what you think. And then I have ideas to help. So the ideas could be remodel the environment, which is simply putting a gymnastics to-go bag in front of the door, right? And then maybe you have a list of pictures of like making sure everything's in your bag. But either way, the bag is at the door. And then that's to help with inhibitory control. So she doesn't have to go upstairs and get distracted by her dolls. Everything's downstairs, right? She won't get distracted. And then you have working memory, which is routine plus reminder. So the routine is when I get to the door, I grab my gymnastic bag, and the reminder is visual because the bag's right next to the door, right? So you're using those different things to help Kiara. So in summary, executive function problems are part of life, right? And there are solutions and supports that help everybody. Even if your kid has executive function challenges or not, these tools help everybody, right? We talked about these concepts and we talked about these tools. How do I know if my child needs extra support from a coach? It's about function. So even with these supports, if your child is still struggling, that could be when a coach could be helpful, an executive functioning coach. And again, if they're still having a hard time completing goals and tasks, even after the support provided at home, it might be good to kind of look into professional assistance. Sorry, I'm going through this really fast. Executive functioning coaching is an aim to increase independence in tasks. It's strength-based, meaning that you're looking at what's worked for the child or young adult in the past and using strengths to help them complete tasks they want to do. It's based on self-reflection, meaning, what's working about this, what's not working about this, what's getting in your way. It's all these reflection to increase behavioral change and understanding, right? Because if the client doesn't have buy-in, then you're not going to get the behavioral change. So it's really reflecting. There's also parent coaching for younger kids. I would say below middle school, it's really about parent coaching and setting up structures. And the older the kid is, in middle school and above, they have the ability to self-reflect. Then you can do some individual coaching. I know myself, I work with high school and above, but middle school can benefit as well. And then this is the resource. Here's the email address. Here's my email address. The website for Chesapeake Center. This is my email address. And then last but not least, I know I had to whiz through the last bit, but any questions, or I can stay for a little longer. If anyone has any questions for me or comments?
Any questions before I kind of give my closing remarks here? Don't see anybody raising. Oh,
Somebody raise their hand. Yeah.
Yes.
Natasha, hold on one moment, just because I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Let me just give my few little things to make sure if anybody else wants to hop off, if you want to stay on for questions, you can. I do want to thank Amy for doing this presentation for us from the Chesapeake Center, and let you guys know your certificates will be sent out in 5 to 10 business days. They will be sent to the email in which you registered. We either most likely tomorrow, we will send out the slideshow, and Amy provided us with a handout that will also be emailed to all the attendees as well. If you have any question, everyone has my email address. So you are welcome to sign out, put your name and county in the chat. If you want to stay on, you have a couple questions, feel free to do so. But thank you guys. Thank you everyone for attending our MRPA Presents, and please be on the lookout for our next one. Thank you guys so much. Natika, before you let me go ahead and turn off the recording, okay?